Thank you so much for being here today. Today, we're going to be talking about SOC compliance and access reviews. As I mentioned a bit earlier, we are very fortunate and lucky to be joined with Raj Sawhney of Focal Point. He's the Managing Director of IT and Internal Audits. He also has over 15 years of progressive experience in cybersecurity and internal audit leadership roles. He's worked creating programs for Fortune 500 companies, and he also has 2 master's degrees as well as CISA, CRISC, and DFE certificates. With that being said, he's going to be talking about SOC compliance. Essentially, what is it? Why does it exist? What it consists of? And then going into this, how do access reviews relate to SOC reporting? Next, we're going to have Garrett Grajek, CEO of UAttest. He's going to talk about access reviews simplified. Then I will run a quick overview demonstration. And finally, hold all your questions till the end because we will have a panelist of Cher, UAttest Product Manager, Garrett, and Raj Sawhney, all answering your questions at the very end there. So please hold on to those. Feel free to chat them in though. And with that being said, let's be conscious of your time and get started. Raj, please take it away. Thanks for joining.
All right, thank you, Austin. Appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for joining today. So basically in the next 45-50 minutes, what we want to do is we want to give you a good background on SOC reporting and kind of see how it applies to your organization, and then the takeaway they can obviously apply to your organization. The way we'll go about this is I'll give you a brief overview about the SOC reports and basically the type of SOC reports that are available to the organization, how they might be applicable to you, and then we'll go more into details about kind of what do you need to do with them. In my experience as an auditor, I almost 95 out of 100 times run into organizations that either have not evaluated their complementary user entity controls. So I will explain what complementary user entity controls are, and then how to go about maybe start evaluating those, and then obviously how UAttest can help in that process as well. So just starting off from the key terms, the service organization, when we talk about the service organization, what are we really talking about? So this is a provider of the service. So a lot of the times now we're using SaaS providers, infrastructure, platform as a service. And so these are basically service providers. And when you utilize a service provider, like many organizations are doing now, they usually have to issue what's called a Service and Organization Controls Report, or SOC report. There's 3 flavors. Actually, there's more than 3 flavors, but the 3 main ones that we'll be talking about today are the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. And there's also SOC for cybersecurity, and there's a few others, but those are the 3 primary ones. And so if you are a consumer of financial reporting information, then you're going to be getting a SOC 1 report from your service provider, whether that be a NetSuite, a Salesforce, a Workday. It could be your main ERP system or a periphery system. So it's not as applicable to your core financial reporting application. But if, for example, if you're using Workday as HR, that's going to be actually included in your financial reporting as well. So you're going to have to obtain a SOC 1 report. Typically, these SOC reports are either issued on an annual basis or semi-annual basis. So based upon your specific organization and what applications are in scope for you, you'll have to follow up accordingly based upon the reporting schedule of that reporting entity. So who is a service auditor? So when I talk about obtaining a SOC report, what happens is a CPA firm, usually a firm that is licensed to do attestation, for example, Focal Point, basically does a audit over the user entity so that the consumer of that service doesn't have to do it themselves. That's the real purpose of a SOC report. So for example, I used to do the ADP SOC reports, and ADP is, or at least was, consumed by like 90% of the organizations. So they're not going to go and audit ADP to do payroll. Instead, they'll rely upon the SOC report in order to use the ADP services. The catch is that when you use any of these services, the complementary user entity controls or CUECs are still the responsibility of the user entity, the company that's using the SaaS service, is using the infrastructure service. They're still responsible for those controls. And that's the CUECs I was referring to earlier, where a lot of organizations are not aware they have that responsibility. So they get kind of blindsided when they find out that they have to, do these complementary user entity controls. So users and user auditors. So I mentioned about the clients of the service organization. That would be like for example, your companies that you work for. Those would be the users. And then we talked about a little bit about the types of SOC reports. So SOC 1 primarily having to do with financial reporting, internal controls over financial reporting, and then SOC 2 having to do with security, availability, process integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. These are the assertions. So what happens is when you do the SOC 2, there are controls that are basically helping to meet the assertions of security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. So if I am doing, the SOC report as a organization for information security or IT security, I'm going to focus more on the SOC 2, because the consumer of that's going to want a SOC 2. For example, if I am in InfoSec at my organization, if I'm IT at my organization, I'll probably want the SOC 2 report. But if I'm a financial auditor, if I'm a controller, a CFO, I'm probably going to want the SOC 1 report. So the audience for these reports are slightly different. What's not listed on this screen is also the SOC 3, which we'll go in a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned, the three different types, we do have the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3. So SOC 3 is a little bit different, in that it is not a attestation report. So attestation meaning that the CPA firm is attesting that everything is working properly. It's more of a report to look at the design of the control rather than the operating effectiveness. If you're interested in more about the intricacies of what's the difference between the design and the operating effectiveness, I can go through that with you in detail. Maybe just send me a message and I'll be happy to go through that with you. But basically, that's the primary difference between the SOC 2 and SOC 3. So why do people do a SOC 3? Well, because a SOC 3 is not an attestation report, and it's basically done to show that, look, I have design controls for information security, data privacy, for process integrity, that I can then get a seal, or you get basically a certification to put on your website, and that gives confidence to your customers and to your vendors that you're meeting these requirements. But it is not something that the CPA firm signs off on, because they haven't done the test of operating effectiveness. So there's a value to doing the SOC 3, but it's not the same type of value that we get from a SOC 1 or SOC 2. So we talked about the SOC 1 report, internal controls over financial reporting. For those that been around the industry for a long time, they used to be called a SAS 70. So if you see some people referring to it as a SAS 70, what they really mean is a SOC 1 now. They've changed the name. I think before that it was to call the SSA 16 as well. So if you hear the names of SSA 16, SAS 70, that basically translates into the SOC 1 report now. So we talked about the security, availability, confidentiality, process integrity. So these are the assertions. One of the key things to note in looking at or in performing a SOC assessment for your organization is that these are not identical, but they're going to be similar to the high trust principles. So high trust is based on the NIST CSF, and that's more of a control-based framework. So if you're going to do a SOC 2, you're not 100%, but you're going to be also getting yourself in line to do a high trust certification. So that's kind of a value add benefit in doing this exercise as well. And then within the SOC reports themselves, there are two types. So I kind of alluded to this earlier when we talked about the SOC 3 being only the design. So in the SOC 1 and SOC 2, you also have type 1, which is only a test of the design of the controls. That's basically saying that the control exists, it's working properly for the process, but we can't guarantee it's working correctly all of the time. That basically means it's designed properly. And then if I talk about the type 2, it's really looking at the operation effectiveness. That is to say that the controls are working over a period of time, which is why the SOC reports are generally provided on an annual or semi-annual basis, um, provided twice a year basically, so that they can say, okay, for this time frame, the controls were operating effectively, versus them just saying that they're designed appropriately. So depending on your need, you would want to obtain those types of reports. If you're doing financial reporting, you're going to need the SOC 1 type 2. If you're doing anything for information security or IT, you're probably going to need the SOC 2 type 2. So I would say like 90% of the time, you're going to probably want the type 2 report, because it's not going to do you much benefit to get the controls from the service organization without knowing that they're operating effectively. Next slide, please. All right, so this is really looking at it from a perspective of, if I am, a service organization, then what do I need to do to make sure that my customers use my product and service? So if I am providing information security services, chances are that my customers are going to ask for a SOC report. And so this is not something that it can be done overnight. It has to be done by designing the controls that we alluded to earlier, and then making sure you have an effective control framework. So at Focal Point, we provide this attestation service as well, and we have a separate attestation license for that. So that's kind of where you see the second bullet point kind of alludes to the Burke and Associates, which is our basically licensed entity for SOC reporting. And the purpose here is to be able to evaluate both the design of the controls to help build out those controls. So we're not auditing per se until we do the actual attestation, but we actually help the firm to define what controls should be in place. It's key to note that a lot of those controls are also going to help you with your internal controls over financial reporting, as well as other standards, especially if you're going to try to get a SOC 2 report. Because the SOC 2 is going to meet a lot of the FedRAMP type of requirements. It's going to meet a lot of the requirements for ISO, for NIST. So there's a lot of overlap there in terms of SOC 2. So that's the type of process that we provide before we do the actual attestation work. Next slide, please. I think we've covered a majority of this, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of this. I think that here the key thing to note would be that this is not a set and forget process, and it goes both ways. So if I am the provider of the SOC report, then I have to make sure that I update my control structure for the SOC reporting on an annual or semi-annual basis. And then I need to make sure that I basically make sure the scoping is proper, the controls are proper, and then the process itself is updated, because this is not something you can just rinse and repeat, given the fact that your organization is going to change over time, obviously. You're going to have new systems in scope. You're going to have different thresholds of risk. So the risk assessment will change year over year. So from a provider of the SOC report perspective, you want to make sure that you are following through that process. But then if you're the consumer of the SOC report, which is probably 80%, 90% of the people on this call, you're going to want to make sure that the service organization has updated those controls and the processes and systems, because you as the organization aren't going to be able to rely upon it unless they're updating it. And then also there's no issues and exceptions. So you'll notice that there might be no issue the first year, but then, or the first half of the year, and then there's an issue the second half of the year. That's because the entity may have changed, or the control environment may have changed, the operating effectiveness may have changed. So you want to make sure you don't perceive this as a set and forget exercise. It's not a rinse and repeat. It does change slightly over the course of the year. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we discussed about the operational effectiveness. So I have some examples I'll go through later on what these control descriptions look like. In particular, the complementary user entity controls, and that's basically there to give you a flavor of when you read the SOC report, what is it that you should be looking for? How is it going to help you identify the key controls for your organization and the key complementary user entity controls? So that I have some examples in the next few slides. Next slide, Austin. Okay, I think this slide is basically a good way of summarizing. If you're a consumer, as I mentioned about the financial reporting, what is the benefit to you and what's included. Similarly for the SOC 2. And then I think SOC 3, a lot of people may have some questions there because it's not something that they readily look at. It's, like I said, for more marketing consumer confidence, because you can freely distribute it and you get that seal and report on your website. So that is actually the reason why people go for the SOC 3. But just keep in mind that it's not going to be of the same rigor, and it's not going to have an attestation on the operational effectiveness. So it won't meet the requirements of the regulators. So just keep that in mind. It is useful more as a marketing tool for consumer confidence than it is for meeting regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, I'm probably not going to go through this slide in too much detail. I think suffices to say that you do sometimes need to combine the reporting requirements depending on your particular needs. So if you are doing ICFR, you may actually need controls for both SOC 1 and SOC 2 because you will probably have to do now a certification over the cybersecurity of your organization, which will require you to also look at the SOC 2. So depending on the control framework, if it's FedRAMP, ISO, you'll probably need both, or at least one of these reports, depending on your organization. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're really getting into the complementary user entity control. So typical SOC reporting structure, you do have the auditor's opinion. What the auditor opinion means is that if it's unqualified, that basically means that they are not saying that our opinion is qualified by any exception or any issue. So unqualified SOC report is a good thing. If you have a qualified a SOC report, that basically means there's the entity that did the attestation is saying that we attest to these controls that are working, except these qualifications. We found these issues, or this area may not be working. So, we leave it up to the user entity to determine how it impacts them. So unqualified is what you want to see in the auditor opinion. And if it's a qualified, then you'll have to dig in deeper on what the qualification is and how it impacts your organization. The other areas that are included, management's assertions. These are assertions on which controls they deem to be key controls. As I mentioned, the description of the system has to be updated regularly. And so that's actually a section by itself in the SOC report. And then the complementary user entity controls is a separate section, which impacts if you are the user of the SOC report. This is where you want to hone in your efforts. You can actually search the word complementary in the SOC report, and it will actually pop up. So that's the easy. It's like kind of a cheat way of finding it. You don't have to read the whole SOC report. If you want to save time, just search for the word complementary, and it'll take you straight there. it might be mentioned in different areas because they actually describe what it's for and how you're supposed to meet the control requirements. But that's the easier way of finding it. So I'll go through in some more detail in the next few slides on the CUECs as well. And then it goes through the section 3, which is the control objectives. As I mentioned, those have to be updated regularly as well. And then mapping to the organization's controls. This really has to do with how are they meeting those trust principles based on the controls they have in place. Are they actually be able to show that they have process integrity based upon the controls, and then availability, confidentiality, etc. So, and the last section really just talks about what's out of scope for them. So depending on your organization, you would probably want to review that too, just to make sure they actually covered what you're using that service for. Next slide, please. Okay, so the report will reference the management responsible for preparing the system description. I think we've gone through most of this. Providing this data services and the risks we talked about. I think the risks themselves, they probably shouldn't change too much year over year, but you want to make sure that they do identify the proper risks because the whole SOC report is based upon the risk assessment. So that's a key area, obviously, you want to focus on when you review the SOC report. Make sure they identify the risk that you're really interested in as a user entity. Next slide, please. All right, so I think in this slide, just going one level deeper in terms of what the SOC reports actually provide. We talked about the financial reporting aspect. We talked about the SOC 2 and the SOC 3. So IT general controls, I think these are, for an IT auditor, it'd be easy to understand. But if you're not an IT auditor and you're wondering what IT general controls are, these are basically looking at access to programs and data, computer operations, change management, system development. These are your typical IT general control areas. Your entity level controls are going to be more of your governance level controls. And then your business process is going to be really focused on financial reporting aspects, as well as other areas that will be pertinent to operations of the company outside of financial reporting. So these are the types of control structures that you will see that are covered in the SOC 1 and SOC 2 report. So when you review it, you'll notice that the IT general controls are going to be very specific in dealing with those 4 areas I talked about: the access to programs, data, change management, computer operations, SDLC, and they might even go into the data center. And then the business process controls are heavily focused on financial reporting, but they're going to have other areas as well. So you want to focus on those areas that are pertinent to your objective in obtaining the SOC report. Next slide, please. All right, I think these really go into the design of the controls themselves, to making sure that when you if you're going to be the entity providing the SOC report, then you meet the specificity of the activities to make sure that it is actually usable. I won't go into this in too much detail because I think majority of the people on this call are going to be consumers of the SOC report. But if you are going to be issuing a SOC report, then definitely reach out to me and I can help you through this process. Make sure that you define the right controls, make sure that they're actually testable, they're specific, and they're going to provide the right value to your customers and your entities. Next slide, please. All right, so kind of getting to the crux of the matter, the complementary user entity controls. So the service organization is responsible for identifying the CVCs. So when I am the issuer of the SOC report, as I mentioned, you can actually search complementary in the SOC report and it'll pop up. And what it will show is that the purpose of the CUECs, it will say the CUECs that are required for each area. For example, for logical access, what do you as a user entity need to do? for computer operations, what do you as a user entity need to do? Similarly for change management, so on and so forth. So I'll actually detail that out for you. For every SOC report is going to be slightly different, but I provided some examples so you can get a flavor of what it looks like. And then I think another key thing from this slide is that the reliance on subservice providers. So what is a subservice provider? So a subservice provider is one step removed from your service provider. So for example, I as an entity use AWS. AWS in turn uses XYZ data center. Well, actually, they would have their own data center, but let's say that they are relying on somebody else for payroll or HR, and they use a third-party service provider for that. Or I am a consumer of Salesforce, and Salesforce uses a third-party data center. So in both of those cases, you'll see AWS and Salesforce, they have a subservice provider. The interesting thing to note there is that a lot of regulators are now asking for are you evaluating your subservice provider? And the reason they're asking these questions is because the SOC reports are not detailed enough to cover those subservice providers. They're listing them for you. They're saying these are our subservice providers, but beyond that, there is no evidence to show that they're operating effectively, even though they're relying upon them. So I'm putting that out there because it is something that your regulators are going to ask for. And then you should at least ask for your service organizations, what are they doing to cover the risk around subservice providers? So if I'm Salesforce, I'm using a third-party data center, then am I covering the risk that comes with using that third-party data center? And similarly for AWS, Azure, et cetera, it's going to be the same story. So just want to make sure that you're asking the right questions when reviewing the SOC report. That's one of the key things to consider. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do I do with the CUECs if I'm a user entity? So basically, I review the complementary user entity controls and the associated control objectives. So for example, I have a control around accessing the data from the service provider. And in order to utilize that data, I need to make sure that my users are appropriate. And I need to make sure that the administrator is appropriate on their system, and the service organization doesn't take any accountability or responsibility over that. So my control objective over access to programs and data will have a CUEC that talks about user access review of the individuals with access to that particular service provider. So that's an example of a review for a CUEC having to do with logical access. Similarly, for change management, they'll probably want to make sure that you give right migration access or other type of access if you're using a third-party service provider to help with change management issues. But mostly I see that it is access related, just because all the change management happens in the background for a service provider. So it's usually logical access and user access reviews that are going to be pertinent to you as a user entity, and which is one of the key things that UATest can help out with, is to automate a lot of those user access reviews so that you can actually use your third-party service providers. The second bullet point really just goes to the point of saying, did the CUCs apply to your organization? Because you may or may not be using all of their services. So you want to make sure that it is going to be pertinent to your organization, and you're utilizing the service that the SOC report is issued for. Sometimes there are multiple SOC reports from one organization, so you want to make sure you obtain the right SOC report. So for example, ADP issues like 7 or 8 different SOC reports, total pay card, UPC, and unemployment compensation services, and so on and so forth. So there are different types of SOC reports for the same organization. Make sure you obtain and review the right one. And then you got to make sure you document how you actually review the complementary user entity controls and how you address the risk. So for example, if you said that a CUEC was not applicable to us, you need to justify why it was not applicable to you. And then you need to be able to explain and document that, so that if an auditor comes back, if your external auditor comes back, if the FDIC comes back, anybody else wants to know what did you do to absolve that risk, then you have that documented. Similarly, you want to make sure that I mentioned about the new SOC report, that each new SOC report can have significant changes. So you want to make sure that you're doing this not as a set and forget, but the CUECs can slightly change. Their environment can change. So you want to do this on an ongoing basis. You probably want to make somebody responsible for it on an ongoing basis. Next slide, please. All right, so I alluded to this earlier. So this is, I took out the names of the service providers, but what I've provided here is basically what the language looks like from the SaaS provider on the CUECs as it relates to user access reviews. So you can see, going through some of these, user entities are responsible for reviewing and maintaining user accounts, access permissions, and I changed it to our platform because I didn't want to say the company name, but this is verbatim the language you will see in the CUECs. And then you see in the second one, the verbiage changes slightly based on the control requirements and the way they want the risk covered, but the essence is almost always the same. The essence is basically they want a user access review to cover the same risk, which is that, are you giving access to the right people to our organization? That's pretty much what it comes down to. They sometimes focus more on privileged access management, which is why we obviously focus our area on risk there. But in general, they want to make sure that you're maintaining sufficient permissions for all those individuals that have access to their systems. And obviously, they're not taking any accountability or responsibility over that. So what UATest can help and provide is an automated solution to help manage that risk. So you can kind of take some of this CUEC burden, if you will, from your organization and shift some of that risk to them. So I will hand it off to Garrett and team to kind of go through and kind of figure out how they can help you in this process.
Austin, you're on mute.
Oh, is that better? There we go.
Yeah, 100%. It shows that we're live, people, and that's why we have a whole bunch of questions, and we're going to do a Q&A session at the end.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. Thank you so much, Raj. You got the questions flowing. People, please keep on writing in your questions. And with that being said, I'm going to pass on over to Garrett. He's CEO of UATest, and he's going to walk through how UATest really helps simplify your access reviews. So thank you, Garrett. Please take it away.
Yeah, first, let me thank Raj. That was great. That was great. I know we're all scribbling notes because Raj talks, people listen. He's got a great prezo up there, guys, on from UCI alumni chapter on David privacy. Yeah, you're smiling, Raj, because that was a real good talk you had there. So check it out on YouTube, guys. Okay, let's go, Austin. UATest. Little context switch. That's what we do in computers. Context switch. You had the general. Now I'm going to get really specific on access reviews. UATest exists to create your reports for auditing. And so we're talking about SOX reporting today. Let's talk UATest. Next. Bottom line, real tactical here. Part of your type 2 reports is showing access reviews. Who has what? And why did you grant? That's exactly the check boxes that UATest fills. Okay. Now, everyone that's calling is going to be like, okay, I got it. I mean, Raj has told us and will tell us more when we contact them directly and tell them our requirements from our environment that we will have to do these types of access reviews. Okay. I'm going to go into specifics more and some later, and we're going to show a demo. But for your knowledge, that's exactly where we're playing at UATest. We're taking your environment or going through your user access roles and privileges and then quantifying them via the auditors. In either way, you're doing this every 6 months or every 12 months, or whether you're doing it for a different regulation, be it SOX, ISO 2700, HIPAA, High Trust, PCI, DSS, etc. Next. The reason why I start with the functionality and then the obvious question goes, okay, but we're doing this or we have plans to do this. There's two ways people are doing this. They're either doing it manually, which is really expensive. I've been on calls with people who said, yep, we're doing this and it's taken a month. Our last webinar, if you look it up, we did it with a company called Vituity. They said it was taking a month due to their access reviews. They're knocking these things out in a couple of hours or a couple of days at best, okay? Or the legacy solutions in for IGA are very expensive. We come in for $2 per user per month, okay? And that's down in volume. Legacy solutions, I've been in calls where it's $800,000 to do a POC, all right? That's can't be happening in 2021, and it's consuming too much of your budget. Next. When I throw out a number like that, $800,000 for a POC, people are like, well, I have to, back it up. Why is it that much? Why is it that much? Because what you're buying is a whole nother set of agents. What we've done, and to go into the solution a little, what we've done is write our APIs right into your SSO tool that already has agents and pulling that data. And yes, we work closest with Okta. So if you have Okta, that's great. If not, we'll tell you some other ways to do this. But with Okta for this slide and for this discussion is your solution. We're taking our data from there. The traditional IGA solutions have their own agents, and that is where the costs come in configuration, deployment, and then maintenance of those agents. And since we're all security guys for a real job, right? That adds another vulnerability. SolarWinds happened because it was one more agent, okay? And we know on this call that we're responsible for everything deployed into our enterprise. There is no, well, that was just the vendor's problem. Next. So simplify your environment with a product like UAttest for your IGA access reviews. This is our deployments. Our deployments, and Austin will run a demo. We're not going to go into deeps, and because we want to take your requirements and show you how that will work. But what you'll see is it literally deploys in minutes. It's SSO. It really is. It's either using OAuth or SAML to connect into your identity management in your IAM product, Okta, and then pulling out the information and creating meta tags for it to allow you to attest to the roles and privileges. Notice what I said, meta tags, not taking your data and not replicating your data. Guys, that's why we keep getting hacked, okay? That's a whole nother webinar. We keep getting hacked because we keep replicating data, we keep replicating functionality, and the hackers, all they're doing is pen testing us all day long, all of us being us, and seeing where you've left the data and finding your weakest link. We have to consolidate our platforms and to use existing data and not keep replicating it. Next. Okay, so let's go to the 3 functionalities that are relevant to SOC reporting. User access reviews, that's obvious. Privileged accounts, and then something that's kind of cool. And I also want to show triggers. Triggers for your key changes. Could be triggers on anything, but where it's relevant to the SOC and other reports is on your key security groups and your admin groups. Changes. Next. Access reviews. Bread and butter. That's why we exist. UAttest equals access reviews. Name of the webinar, name of what we're doing. And by this time, after having this product out for about 2 years, taking in customer requirements, taking in amazing input from Raj and team, and from the side that's providing the PVCs provided by clients, we built this out the way you need it. You can review by application, by users, by managers, and all the cool features. Multiple reviewers, that is your business side and your application side. Auto schedule, reminding notice, auto delegation, and really what you need, certifying, delegating, and revoke. Next. Privilege accounts. This was really cool. we know, and everyone knows on this call, that really what you have to not only audit, but what the hackers want is access to our admin accounts. Sure, they want to start with G Greyjack, but what they want to do is escalate it up to and add privileges to that account, whoever they get to hack. Okay? We allow you through this product to go through not only your cloud, but also your AD and review those accounts. Next. What's really cool and what really I get quoted a lot in articles about is triggers. Because, as much as we should know we should be doing our reviews as often as possible, and as Raj said, either every 6 months or year for SOC, HIPAA High Trust has some different requirements. But what should be doing is when key admin changes occur, admin changes, that should be a real-time attestation. And not only should it be a real-time attestation, there should be a report generated that you can show Raj and team. Hey guys, we made this changes in this admin group. It was for this reason that you can denote in our product. And it was approved by both the business side and the IT side. Wouldn't that be nice if Raj comes and asks you for that PBC and you had 12 admin changes, you had all 12 reports, and you said, Raj, let's go work on something else, but these are all my changes. That's what we do at UAttest. That's what we use this for, to give you, to take the tedium of creating these PBCs out from you, right? And then allow you to work on other endeavors. Next. Demo time. Love demos. Live. That's what we like. Talk to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Garrett. And so you mentioned we're going to go into a demo, and we are going to keep it very short here because we want to be conscious of everyone's time and make sure that we could get to these questions. So I highly suggest if you want to see a full demo, you can book us, you can check it out on YouTube. But with that being said, I'm just going to jump into a very quick demo here. Garrett mentioned the ease of deployment. So here it is. We're talking quick. We have 3 bits of information. That's all that's required. A friendly name, Okta URL, and API key. It takes about 3 to 10 minutes setting this up. Extremely simple, very easy to do as well. Everything that we're showing is possible through this integration setup right here. No extra steps. So that brings you to the type of audits. Garrett was talking about a few different types of audits, and one thing I want to focus on is going over the privileged access that he mentioned. So we want to see possibly who is a part of a specific group that we want to make sure that we are capturing. We could go to a group audit right here. It's extremely simple. This is already connected, so we just go select the API source. Then what we want to do, we want to find the actual group we're looking for. So I believe the example he had in his slides, when we go back to that, we were going over domain admins. So we'll just name this one. We'll select the due date and click next. And so right here on this screen, what you're able to do, you're able to search for all of the accounts that you would like. So you can see it autofills in here, but we have domain admins monitoring. I'm going to select that group. You could add multiple groups if you like, but I'm just going to go with just this one and click done. And so what's happening right here in the background, it just pulled those 4 users who are a part of this group, and it's giving you the ability to click into this and look at these users. You can see their roles, their type, profile, user manager, job title, and so on. All that information is available to you. And from here, you could review it. You could either just certify off on everyone, or another step that you could do, so you could automatically delegate this out to all your managers to go in there and review everyone, make sure that their access to that group is appropriate. If not, they could go in and revoke that access right there. And then you'll have a nice detailed report that, like Garrett said, you could send on over to Raj and team and make sure that you are actually capturing all this and reviewing your privileged groups. Speaking of privileged groups, you want to be able to capture changes that happen in real time. So another example that we provided was the event triggers. This is very simple. If you're familiar with Okta event hooks, it's exactly like that. We're just creating them inside of UAttest and adding a detailed report. So for this, we'll just name it. We're going to select the source just like before. But now what we could do is we could select conditions that are going to create a report and set up a trigger. So the conditions we want to monitor when someone's added to that group I was just talking about, the domain admins. We want to see if someone's trying to escalate their privilege. We want to capture that in real time. So I'm going to select group events, user added to group, and then we could type in whatever group we're looking for. So I believe in the slide that Garrett was talking about, they were monitoring for admins. So let's actually use that as the group we want to check for. So now if someone adds themselves, or if a user is added to the admins group, we're going to be able to get an alert created. But then we could take it one step further right here and actually create a campaign inside of UAttest and automatically assign this to a certain user, a certain group, or a manager to review that says, hey, someone was added to this group, you need to review it, and then we're going to generate a report once that's been reviewed. So you're capturing changes that are taking place in real time. There's a whole lot more that I could show, but with that being said, I'm just going to jump back over and we're going to take some questions over here. I see them piling on in, so let's go over to that right now.
So I did answer some questions on the chat. It was an open question. I think they're asking for your contact information, Garrett and Austin. So you may want to send that to the attendees as well.
Yeah, we'll do that. Or so, and you reach us right there, or write us at info@uattest.com, or heck, you can write me at ceo@uattest.com, and let's start a dialogue. Okay. Take it away,
Fantastic.
Moderator Austin. You got some extra questions?
Perfect. Yes, let me just pull up the questions. Thank you so much for typing those back, Raj. I really appreciate it. So some other ones that we have coming in right here. Let's start off with Raj as well. And apologies if this has already been answered, but let's go for it. If you are starting from scratch and are a user entity, which SOC report is the best to start with? Why and how long?
All right, so I think the question starts with if you are a user entity. So if you are a user entity, then you're going to want to figure out the purpose of obtaining the SOC report. So if you're obtaining it for financial reporting purposes, then it's the SOC 1 is the one you want to obtain. And if you are part of the InfoSec or IT organization and you're interested in those assertions around process integrity, confidentiality, availability, then you want to obtain the SOC 2 report. Keep in mind that they come in two flavors, SOC 1 type 1, SOC 1 type 2, or vice versa, the SOC 2 type 1 and type 2. So more than likely going to need to get the type 2 report, and you want to make sure that you're obtaining the right report for the services that you're consuming. So if you are having AWS, for example, or Salesforce or ADP, they issue multiple SOC reports. So you have to be specific on the product it is that you're actually using from that service organization so they can give you the right SOC report.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Raj. The next question, Cher, I'll have you take this one. So it is, what about if I just have Active Directory? Can I use UAttest? So I know we mentioned Okta a few times, but do you mind touching on our Active Directory abilities?
Yes, so definitely we are working on a feature, and the engineers are working on that feature as we speak, and which is called an AD audit, where the user can extract the AD records via a PowerShell script, and then that can be loaded into UAttest. So this feature is something that we are working on. It will be pushed into production within 2 to 3 weeks of time. And any one of you guys, if there's a match, contact us. We'll get back to you and have a demo for you guys, so we can demonstrate how exactly that can be achieved.
Yeah, good answer there, Cher. And that happens a lot in these webinars. People are interested in this. They don't have something like Okta yet. We work out a system. We dump all the information to CVS and upload it and allow you to do the workflow. Many of our customers are using that. And yes, glad you working on it, especially AD. We're doing a custom one just to make sure we can do AD and other sources. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cher. Raj, I see that you snagged a question, said you were going to answer it live. Do you mind answering if the company has both the SOC 2 Type 1 and SOC 2 Type 2, is there a reason to request both?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. We alluded to this in the presentation, but just to expand on that, there would be multiple reasons to request both. I'll give you a couple of examples. Uh, so first example will be for financial reporting. Most organizations now have to opine to their cybersecurity posture as part of their financial reporting. And so for that reason alone, you would probably need to obtain the SOC 2 report for those assertions that we mentioned earlier. So that would be one example. Another example is that outside of financial reporting, for compliance, for example, if you're doing a change management audit, for example, that has nothing to do with SOX, but as part of a IT internal audit initiative, you need to obtain a SOC report for that. If you're trying to gain other FedRAMP compliance, other types of compliance, you're going to need to obtain a SOC 2 report from your service providers. So there could be multiple instances that you would require them, that you will be required to obtain both the SOC 1 and SOC 2 report. I think this question also asks, is there a reason we would need to obtain a Type 1 separately from maybe a Type 2? And the answer is that if you're going to obtain a Type 2, you're already obtaining a Type 1. So you would need to obtain the SOC 2 Type 1 and SOC 2 Type 2 because SOC 2 Type 2 would cover that Type 1 as well. Basically, if the organization is doing a SOC 2 Type 2, more than likely they don't have the Type 1 because it's already covered in the Type 2. It would basically be taking stuff out and then providing it to you in a Type 1. There would be very rare instances of that if they wanted to control risk or something to that effect. But in general, if the organization has a SOC 2 Type 2, they're probably not going to issue a SOC 2 Type 1.
Excellent, thank you. And it sounds like you could have answered this one already, but I really like this question, so I just want to read it out again. Raj, this is to you as well. It's, as a consumer of a SaaS provider, where should we start with SOC reports?
Sure. So I think we went through some of the steps, and they're available in the deck as well on how you should go about reviewing the SOC report as a consumer of the SaaS provider. One of the things I would just say to save you time is if you open up with a SOC report, make sure you get the right SOC report with the right schedule, the timing wise, and then search for the word complementary. It'll actually go to the complementary user entity controls, and it'll probably give you a description of what they are. It'll go through in multiple areas of the report what the purpose is, and then it'll actually go through area by area. The ones I included were for logical access. That were actually the verbiage I copied and pasted and took out the name of the service organization. So you'll have that same verbiage in the SOC report. And then once you obtain the CUECs, the next step is really to map it to your own control environment. Do you actually have those controls in place? If you don't have them, then you'll have to actually implement those controls. And if you do have them, then you have to basically show that they're operating effectively if you're relying upon that service. And then the ones that are in the SOC report that maybe are not applicable to you, you may not have to test them, but you need to justify why they're not in scope for you. So this is the exercise that has to be performed by management. If you need any help doing that, we can certainly help. My team and I can certainly help in completing that task as well.
Excellent. And Garrett, I see that you claimed one of the questions on here. Did you want to get to that one?
Yeah, tell me, I don't know what I'm doing on Zoom. So
yeah, no worries. So the question is more of a comment, but it's only a month. That's quick. And
no, I like what because that's what we've been talking to these people. I mean, the process is broken. The process is too expensive of having teams go back and forth with the data that we showed. That's why we've automated the process through the GUI. In the end user's right. A month is a low amount of time. I mean, we have teams that do it. In truth, these access reviews and some of the companies we have talked to is just almost an ongoing process, because they start one, they do a HIPAA, they do a high trust, and they do a SOX, and then they're doing these others, and we can save a lot. We have a whole TCO spreadsheet, which we created, and this is what's interesting. We created not to convince you, the people who use this stuff, because you know this, but to help you sell it to your management. So let me just summarize my answer that way. Not only that, we have a CPA, we paid a CPA to create a TCO sheet and can help quantify this and help you get a tool like UATest in to address these issues in a quicker and more rapid manner.
Fantastic. I even see you're getting some love in the chat room, so that's great. Raj, it looks like you claimed another question on here, so I'm just going to read it out and then feel free to answer it. But what is the typical range in cost for hiring a company to perform a SOC 2 Type 2 report? How long does one usually take?
This is a good question. I've done SOC reports for very large companies and then much smaller companies. So I think it depends on the size of the organization, and the cost can vary quite significantly. So it can be in the range somewhere of $35,000 on the lower end. That's for a SOC 2 Type 2. And on the higher end, if you look at the AWS and ADP, it could be like 3 to 4 million. So it's a huge range. Obviously, a lot of it is based on the amount of services that you're providing, your control environment, the complexity of your IT environment, your business processes. So the range is quite significant, depending on your organization. So anywhere between 35,000 is what I've seen on the lower end, maybe even 30,000, 32. And then the higher end is like 3 million. So it's a huge range, is I think the point.
Great, thank you. Okay, so looks like we have a couple more questions coming in. We are running out of time, but Cher, really quickly, can you answer this one? So the question is, what about if I want to audit my HR system?
So from UATest perspective, yes, that can happen, and it's like this. So whether the data is an HR data or it is coming from any other data source, as long as it is available in a CSV format, we can get that loaded into UATest for attestation purposes. So that can happen, and this is something that we provide within UATest.
Thank you so much, Cher. Perfect. It looks like, so
yeah,
we have
so why don't you take one more and then we'll wrap it up, and reach out to us, guys. We'll be good. Yeah.
Fantastic. So we do have this one, and it's, are SOC 3 reports required now? Raj, you mind taking that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think a lot of companies are interested in SOC 3 reports because they are available to display that certification, if you will. It's actually the emblem, really, more than a certification, that you are having controls in place that are going to give your vendors and your customers some level of assurity that you have proper controls around availability, confidentiality, process integrity, privacy, etc. Key thing to note there is not an attestation. There's no test of operating effectiveness. So it's not going to serve the same purpose as the SOC 2 Type 2, but it does provide some level of assurance. And so it is really meant as a marketing tool and actually costs less. So I think the question earlier was, how much does a SOC 2 Type 2 cost? So if you're really interested in it from marketing perspective rather than a compliance and regulatory perspective, SOC 3 is the way to go because there's no operating effectiveness involved. So your cost is going to be significantly lower. SOC 3s might cost somewhere around 15,000 or 10,000 even, as compared to, you're talking about double, triple that for the SOC 2 Type 2. So if your purpose is for marketing purposes, then definitely the SOC 3 is the way to go. I wouldn't say it's a requirement, but a lot of the market is driving the demand for that, because the vendors and customers, they want to see that you have these controls in place. And so the SOC 3 becomes a very cost-effective way of doing that.
Rock and roll, guys. That was a great discussion. I never look at the registrants, but I broke my rule this time, and we had more on than ever before. So fantastic. Thanks a lot, Raj. Thanks for the prezo and staying around for the questions. And Raj, for people who want to get hold of you directly, what's the best way?
Yeah, I think that we'll send out my contact information, but easiest way is find me on LinkedIn. It's just Raj Sawhney, and you can find me directly on LinkedIn. I'm happy to talk to you and answer any other questions you may have.
Yeah, and like I said, if you got direct questions, people, send it to CEO@uats.com or write us at info@uats.com, and the greater team, including Sharon, Austin, others, will grab it. Okay? All the best, team.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you. Take care.